2, 1. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Countless Vlogcast, episode 37, with my guest Justin Lee Anderson, author. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing great. So tell us about yourself.
Okay, so I'm Justin Lee Anderson. I am Edinburgh born, but I actually grew up in the US for about 11 years before we moved back here when I was a teenager. I am a fantasy author, and I've been writing for about, I've been published for just over 5 years. I've been writing for about 20, so there you go.
So in your process of writing too, how do you feel you've grown as a writer from like this stibble dabbing in writing to like professionalism? How did you feel like you transitioned to like writing as a beginner to like professional writing?
Sure. Wow, that's a big question. So when I first started writing sort of 20 years ago, when I was just out of university, really, how was I different? I don't think I was as good a writer, but then I suppose everybody would say that everybody would like to think you become better the more you write, don't they? I think that I think the biggest obstacle I had to overcome was the belief that I could do it, actually. Looking back, I think it's the reason it took me so long. I think it's the reason I made the early mistakes I made in terms of what to focus on and how to go about it. I think it was all because there was a bit of a glass ceiling in my head of whether or not it would be possible to do it. And I think part of what changed that was probably the evolution of ebooks and the ability to, publish yourself ultimately. I think that kind of helped clear that. And I had a lot of people who believed in me, and I had a lot of people who were supportive, and that definitely helped too. But yeah, I think the self-belief to do it, I wish I'd had the belief in my 20s that I have in my 40s.
Yeah, but you never know. It's never too late to start, though. So that's like it's good for like authors watching this too, and potential writers that want to publish too. Like it's never too late to like get started too. So
absolutely, yeah, that's very true.
What was that moment like you published your first actual book as a professional? What was that like? How did you feel? Like were you nervous, or you like?
Was I? Oh gosh, yes. It all felt quite surreal. So I was in an interesting situation. So what had happened with me was with my first novel, I had a deal with a new small press who liked my book, and one of the editors there, she had seen some samples of my writing from a website years ago, and I hadn't finished it yet. So I was working on it. I finished it. But by the time I finished it, unfortunately, the press had shut down. And so I'd finished this book, and the press just weren't viable, unfortunately. But what she did was, and she was brilliant for this, introduced me to another small press that she had a connection with. And they picked up my deal, and they published it instead. And so it was all a bit unusual, I suppose. I don't think it's even vaguely a traditional element to how I've gone about being published. So these guys basically came along at Wild Wolf and said, "Yep, we like this book. We'll publish it on a very loose agreement, and as long as it works for us both, let's see what happens." And it was great. And seeing my book actually in print was a thrill, I suppose. I think excited. I suppose excited encapsulates it, but it was all a bit of an unlikely experience, I guess.
So it's like the roller coaster, like a feeling too. It's like when you first get started, you're like writing the book, and you're like, "Oh my god, I can't write," and then you keep writing, and you get it's like a momentum builder too, like a roller coaster too. So,
absolutely,
what's your genre of writing, and how'd you get into that genre?
As I said, it's fantasy. My first book was a comedy fantasy in the vein of somebody like Tom Holt. Which the elevator pitch is: an Edinburgh hermit discovers that his living room carpet is the deciding factor in a bet between God and Satan. And it was just an idea that I had after it was actually after reading a Neil Gaiman comic, an issue of Sandman. And this mad idea came to me, and I was like, "Oh, I must remember that." And I remember at the time I actually spoke it into a dictaphone I had taken to carrying around with me to record ideas at the time. And it took me a while to figure out what to do with that, and then I came up with the character. But Sorry, do you know, I've completely forgotten the question. I've forgotten what I'm rambling about.
Oh
What did you
yeah.
ask me?
So how did you discover your genre? How did you get into
Oh
that
yeah, of
genre?
course. Yeah. So the genre was it was pretty much what I grew up on. I mean, I grew up very much on, I mean, as a young kid, I grew up on comics, you know, DC and Marvel. And then I moved into more fantasy stuff with Narnia early on. And then I found a guy called Piers Anthony when I was sort of 12, 13. Absolutely devoured all of his books, adored them. He got me into more adult fantasy later on with the likes of, you know, Robert Zelazny and Terry Brooks and things like that, and then further on. But actually, a lot of the stuff I was reading at the time my first published novel was more comedy fantasy stuff. Neil Gaiman was in there, although I wouldn't call him comedy. But Neil Gaiman's early novels were a big influence, and things like Jasper Fforde and Tom Holt were things I really enjoyed. And subsequent to that, I started reading more fantasy again after finding Joe Abercrombie, which is what got me back into straight fantasy, sort of more serious fantasy. And that pulled me into reading some more stuff like that, which has pushed me forward from there.
Okay, great. So talk about the recent publication you've done in like the past couple of years, like recent books.
Sure. So my most recent book is The Lost War, which is I describe it as an epic fantasy mystery set in a kingdom that's based on the history and mythology of Edinburgh, my hometown. And it's very much different from my first book because apparently the good advice of pick a genre and stick to it, I completely ignored. And so it's much more straight. It's much, I wouldn't call it dark, but it's certainly darker. And it's essentially taking what you would see as a relatively standard sort of D&D party setup, and then hopefully doing something different and unexpected with it, and produce and essentially fitting that into a mystery stroke thriller story, but in a fantasy setting.
Okay, great. So this question is for ask a lot of authors this and a lot of artists this question. What makes you unique? You know, a lot of people are like humble in this question too. They're like they don't think they're unique or they don't think they're like different from other authors. Like, how would you describe your writing and your character and your uniqueness?
My uniqueness. Whoa, that is a hard question. I try to write characters who are real, but then I suppose every author would say that. I also try to bring in, I suppose for me, actually, the thing that drives me a lot, underlying thing, is I have a lot of strong views on things like politics and modern society and culture and things. And I very much tend to bring those into my novels as well, through a combination of characters and dialogue and plot, I suppose. But then, does that make me unique? I don't know. It's a hard question to answer. I suppose I bring my own unique view on politics and the world to my writing, and I don't think you could possibly read my writing and not have a pretty good understanding of what my views are on social issues.
Yeah, I think as you go along too, like with your writers and your readers too, it's like as they get to like read your other books, as you keep going to publish more books, they get to this Justin has more like style. It's like this is his style though. You're not gonna think you're somebody else like writing it too. They're gonna notice your style too. So, who are some of your influences in terms of authors and writers to influence you?
Well, the ones I've named already, definitely. Neil Gaiman was a huge influence on me getting started, and his writing has definitely had a big impact on how or the kinds of stories, I suppose, that I choose to tell. There are a lot of other writers. As I say, Joe Abercrombie got me back into reading fantasy as an adult. People like, I really like a lot of recently published people like Ed McDonald, Anna Stevens, R.J. Barker. I finished a great book last night by Pete McLean, Priest of Bones, which I really enjoyed. There's a lot of really good books around just now. New stuff being published as well as more, the classics of the genre. And it's quite an exciting time to be writing fantasy, I think.
So let's talk about the business side of it, the boring side. How do you promote yourself and brand yourself in terms of like getting your book out there and then like marketing yourself?
So I think that's probably two questions, and I will kind of take it as two. So in terms of promoting, Facebook has been easily my most successful media for promotion. I can pretty much track the success of Facebook ads against sales very directly, and I find that really effective. I find Amazon is much harder to quantify. I find their system difficult in terms of its reporting.
Yeah, because like it's like the keywords and all that too. Everybody's trying to like tell you about the keywords, like ask like somebody for like their like experience. They have to like, put in keywords too, but everybody's just congested then, like you're like so.
It is. It's a congested system, and the reporting doesn't help because the reporting doesn't make it easy for you to understand where your sales are coming from. And
sorry to cut you off, but could you break it down a little more? Like, how do you like see your sales for those that don't really understand that in terms of like seeing your sales and like how you're like growing as an author and like the seller? How would you go about?
Sure. So, well, as I say, Facebook ads really effective, and I've definitely seen that. The one thing I found really useful from an early Facebook ad with my first book was I was lucky to have an early review basically compare my book to Good Omens, which I know is a really beloved book and has a big audience. And so, what I was able to do with my Facebook ads was target people who like Good Omens with an ad basically directly comparing me to Good Omens. And I know that on the back of that, sales went up, essentially. It was that simple, because I was able to target people with a specific ad with an independent quote that appealed to them. So that was really effective.
Right, thank you for that advice. So in terms of like now, what are some of your goals in terms of like the I don't know if you guys have quarantine still, but how's it affected your creativity? It's two-parter. How's it affected your creativity, and what are some of your present goals with this going on now?
It affected my creativity a lot. It actually made me swap books because I was writing the sequel to my first book, Carpet Diem, when we went into lockdown, and I've been promising that to people who have read Carpet Diem for a long time, and I just found that with the stress of everything, I just couldn't write comedy. I just couldn't find that kind of flippant, silly mindset that I needed in order to write it. And I banged my head against it for a good few weeks before I eventually had to just accept that I couldn't do it and I had to change books. And so so what I did was I switched to writing the sequel to The Lost War instead, which I had planned to be my next book after the one I was writing. And that has been much more effective. As I say, it's a bit of a darker book. And so being a sort of darker frame of mind, I suppose, and in a darker worldwide situation, I've been able to access that much more easily. My plan is to finish it as quickly as possible. I'm about 65,000 words in, and I'm targeting between 150 and 200 at the moment. My plan is to get it out early next year if I can, and that will be that's my first focus right now.
Great. So when you're writing, what's your process like? Do you look at a blank sheet? Do you brainstorm? Do you just like some people are like pantsers, they just like not wing it, but per se, but they like as they go along, they're like, okay, here's something, and just like start throwing at the paper like it's paint. How would you describe your process?
Sure. I think it's somewhere in between. I've described myself somewhere as a way poster, and what I mean by that is when I go into writing a book, I know the end. Particularly with something like The Lost War, the end of the book was my premise, and everything else built towards that. So I go in knowing the end, and I go in kind of knowing plot points or climaxes that are going to happen throughout the course of the story. What I don't necessarily know is exactly what's going to happen between those plot points. I know they need to get to them, and roughly the order they probably need to get to them in, because that's the overall story. But within that, I am much more likely to try to let the characters drive it in terms of thinking about, well, what are they motivated to do? What's this character going to do next? And in fact, whenever I get stuck, if I ever find myself not knowing quite what to do next, I usually sit down with a notebook, list my characters, and list what they're thinking and feeling at that moment and what they are motivated to do next. And when I do that, it has always got me straight out of the situation and knowing exactly where to go next. Because once you really think about what each of your characters is motivated to do, it will usually let you know what you should be going next.
Great. So, in terms of audience, do you think of audience before you write it, or you think of audience after you write it, or you think it was like a mixed bag?
Um, I I tend to write the kind of story that I would want to read, on the assumption that if I want to read it, other people will too, I guess. So no, if I'm honest, I haven't thought a lot about my audiences, though. I guess what I will say is that um, I I read reviews because, you know, when you're promoting yourself, you have to, in order to pick up on stuff that you can use. So I read reviews of the book, and when I read critical reviews, I try to pick criticism out of them that might be useful. So I suppose my main way of thinking of the audience is that I pick up on previous criticisms and consider whether I agree with them, whether they're fair, and if they are, well, what can I do about it? How can I improve whatever it was that they felt could be better?
So, since you don't think about the audience like per se before when you're writing, what do you want people to take away from your book as like a writer and like a reader? What do you want people? What message do you want people to send to people depending on the book?
Yeah, I mean, so Carpe Diem, as I said, it was a comedy fantasy. It was, I mean, it was supposed to be a bit of a escapism and a bit of fun and a bit of comedy. And I hope, and I think people have, based on reviews, taken all of that away from it. I also hope there's a bit of humanity in there, and a bit about friendship, and a bit about aging, I suppose, and dealing with it in there. With The Lost War, there's a lot of political analogies. Let's try and get that out at the right time. Political analogies in there, and I don't know whether I made them too subtle in some ways. I have had some people sort of say, you know, oh, I love that it's just a story and there's no underlying sort of, you know, it's not trying to be any more than that. And I think, oh, there's quite a lot of political stuff in there that I was hoping might be picked up on. So I don't know. Maybe it will be more obvious into the second book, and I think it probably inevitably will be. I think it's a bit more express in the second book, which is kind of, in some ways, a necessity of the story of the first book. But I hope they will take away what I really hope. I suppose I hope that they will take away that they've had a chance to escape and enjoy another world for a while, and enjoyed the time they spent, and maybe take away some of the cultural and human and political stuff that I've weaved in there.
So, in terms of like reviews and feedback from your publications, would you say it's mostly positive, and would you say people like add to your story, or people are like, this is missing from your story? Did they try to like not per se like find potholes? Yeah, they try to find potholes.
I mean, without question, I have to say I've been very fortunate. Both books, the reviews have been overwhelmingly positive, and that's been a real treat. In fact, I was really worried about writing the second book because it was so different from the first book, and you know, for all that the first book had massively positive feedback and reviews, I was concerned about whether doing something so different would have the same response. If anything, people who have read both books generally tend to tell me that The Lost War is better than Carpe Diem, which I guess, you know, that comes along with being a better writer, but or being a better writer as you get older and more experience. But yeah, it's they have been overwhelmingly positive, but there's still, you know, there is always going to be somebody who just hates a book. And it's, you know, I think initially with my first book, I took, you know, 1-star reviews quite seriously, and I really looked at them and thought, right, okay, this, you know, this person is clearly a connoisseur and they know what they're talking about, whereas everybody else is just being nice, which I think everybody probably does at some point when reading a bad review. But, you know, I mean, now I'm at the point where I read a review recently of The Lost War where this guy just hated it so much that he actually said he wanted me to quit writing, and he thought Amazon should revoke my credentials. And it just made me laugh. I just thought, you know what, that's actually funny, because the way I see it, all art is subjective. And, you know, as long as enough people enjoy it and like it to make it feasible for me to keep writing, then I'm happy. And I suppose the fact that some people can hate it passionately, I don't know, does that make it better art for the fact that people have a passionate response to it? I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, it's great to have that great that demeanor though, because people are gonna say like they're gonna say some shit like you don't like, so they're gonna give you reviews that you're gonna have your trolls, you're gonna have your people that like hate it because they're miserable, and then you got people that love it, and then like people that like kind of love it, and people that want more too. But it's gonna be better. So being an experienced author, do you have any advice for younger authors out there and people like struggling with self-publishing or looking for a publisher out there?
I do, absolutely. And the first is touching on what I said earlier is don't be victim to the glass ceiling in your head. There's no guard stopping you from getting into the publishing world. There's nothing to prevent you. It's not only other people who get published. Absolutely anybody who writes a good story can get published. And especially now in the world we're in now, where you can do it yourself. You don't have to, we're no longer in the position where you have to go through an agent and then a publisher to get published. You can find your own audience. So believe in yourself, I suppose, is my first bit of advice. And the second is, and it's interesting, a writer contacted me the other day on Facebook and was just asking for a bit of advice on this kind of stuff. And my biggest advice ended up being, if you're writing your first book, finish the book. Absolutely finish your first book before you do anything else. Don't be getting ahead of yourself and thinking about, should I submit a bit of this to an agent and see if it's any good? Finish the book, make the book as good as you can, get feedback from friends that you trust. Your first draft will not be your last draft. You're going to have to do some editing. You're going to have to make it better over a couple of drafts before you think about sending it to anybody to look at, in terms of if you were going traditional publishing. But first things first, finish your first draft. I made the mistake with Carpet Diem a long time ago when I had only written about 20,000 words because I didn't believe in myself at that time. I sent those 20,000 words to the woman who was then Neil Gaiman's agent. First ever query I'd ever done. Had no idea what I was doing. Completely naive. And unbelievably, she came back and said, I'd love to read this. Send me the rest. And I didn't have it. I hadn't written it.
Wow.
And I massively blew that opportunity because I hadn't finished the book first. So you got to finish the book. Get the first draft done to the end. And another bit of advice I like about a first draft that I can't remember where I got it from, but somebody said the first draft is you telling yourself the story. It might have been Terry Pratchett, actually, now I think about it. But that, I think, is great advice. The first draft is you telling yourself the story. The edits are where you make it work for an audience.
Well, that's great advice. Thank you for that too. So, what's your next project you're working on during this time?
As I say, I'm working on the sequel to The Lost War. It has the working title of The Insurgent King. I have no idea whether that'll be the final title. I haven't decided yet. I'm already starting to think about other titles that might work better, but that's the working title on it. And it continues the story from The Lost War. I can't say very much about it because by the nature of The Lost War, you can't get anywhere near it without hearing that there's a big twist at the end. And of course, the twist massively informs everything that happens in book 2. So there's only so much I can say. I'll be continuing the story. It'll still continue to have the same sort of social and human and political undercurrents that I try to weave into everything I write.
Okay, great. Not giving too much away. Thank you, though. I like to end these with like a positive message from you to the world out there, and your audience, and you like to share.
What would I like to share? Positive? Yeah, I really would actually. Right at the moment, just look after each other. Be nice to each other. I mean, there is so much. People are so busy arguing with each other at the moment, and people are angry about everything. People are worried about things infringing on their own rights, and can we just all be nice to each other? Can we just all give each other a bit of space and consideration? That'd be nice.
That's great. That's great. So, finally, just drop your all your tags and your website so people can find you and follow you and support you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a website. It's justinleeanderson.com. I have on Facebook and Instagram, I am Justin Lee Anderson Author. And on Twitter, I am Author JLA, which is generally where I tend to keep my political ranting and sweariness. I tend to stick to book and personal related stuff on the other two, but Twitter's where I rant about politics quite a lot.
Yeah, I find that too with Twitter too. It's a perfect place to talk about politics, no matter what side you're on. So thank you, Justin,
Exactly.
for coming on. It's
My
been
pleasure.
wonderful. I'm gonna get this to you on YouTube, and hopefully people watch this, support authors out there, young authors out there, watch this, learn something to people out there, readers, your readers, people that are into like your genre and that come support you. Thank you for coming on again.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Justin.
All right, this has been the Countless Vlogcast, episode 37, with my guest, Justin Lee Anderson, author. Thank you again, and we're out.
Great.